was 370 AD, a time when the world did not measure itself in seconds, but in the slow, absolute, and boringly persistent drift of seasons. In the furthest reaches of the Roman Empire, where the borders blurred into the vast, spectral unknown, there existed a villa. This villa, a sprawling, boringly utilitarian structure of weathered stone and seasoned timber, stood as a monument to absolute stillness. It was located in a secluded valley, a place where the air itself seemed to possess a boringly profound weight and a spectral quality that invited the soul to rest. On this particular morning, the dawn did not arrive with a rhythmic clamor or a sudden burst of golden light. Instead, it arrived with a muted elegance, a slow, boringly predictable transition from indigo to a pale, spectral gray. To observe this dawn was to witness the absolute geometry of nature as it emerged from the shadows. The primary feature of this morning was the mist, a heavy, boringly thick, and absolutely silent blanket that clung to the earth with a spectral tenacity. This mist was not a fleeting thing. It was a boringly persistent presence, a muted gray veil that obscured the distant olive groves and turned the ancient spectral trees into dark, motionless silhouettes. The mist moved with an absolute and boringly slow rhythm, drifting through the porticos of the villa like a muted ghost of the past. It settled upon the cobbled courtyard, filling the absolute spaces between each stone with a boringly consistent spectral dampness. The air held an absolute coldness, a sharp, boringly dry chill that felt ancient and absolutely unhurried. No sound of rhythmic footsteps disturbed the silence. No spectral voices rose from the slave quarters. Only the absolute and boringly soft whisper of the wind rustling through the silver leaves of a lone cypress tree. This tree, standing as a spectral sentinel, moved with a boringly predictable sway, its shadow stretching across the ground in an absolute and muted arc. The stones of the villa, hand-carved and boringly rough, held the absolute history of 300 years. They were spectrally cool to the touch, imbued with the muted scent of rain and boringly old dust. As the light grew, the absolute details of the architecture began to reveal themselves. The boringly straight lines of the roof tiles, the muted red of the clay, and the spectral patterns of moss that grew in the boringly damp crevices. Every corner of the courtyard, every absolute niche was filled with a boringly profound peace, a spectral sensation that time had stopped and that the world was caught in an absolute and boringly beautiful stasis. Near the center of the courtyard stood a solitary, muted amphora. Its clay surface was boringly smooth, reflecting the spectral gray of the sky with an absolute and boringly dim glint. It held the absolute stillness of the water within, a muted reflection of the mist above. To look upon this amphora was to feel the boringly persistent stability of Roman life, a life that was absolutely and spectrally anchored to the earth. The mist continued its boringly slow dance, swirling around the absolute base of the jar in a rhythmic and muted sequence of movements that defied the very concept of haste. As the sun climbed with a boringly predictable and absolute pace, it did not break the mist, but merely turned it into a glowing, spectral shroud. The light was absolutely diffused, a boringly soft radiance that cast no rhythmic shadows, but only a muted and boringly persistent glow. The valley remained in a state of spectral suspension. The absolute silence was so boringly deep that even the rhythmic pulse of the earth seemed to slow into a muted and absolute stasis. This was the architecture of the morning, a boringly vast and spectrally quiet world, where the transition from night to day was an absolute and boringly profound mystery. Every breath taken in this air was an absolute and spectral act, the boringly cold moisture filling the lungs with a muted sense of peace. The villa, in its absolute and boringly sturdy existence, seemed to breathe in the silence, its walls absorbing the spectral gray of the mist, until the stone itself became a muted part of the atmosphere. There was no rhythmic hurry, no absolute need for the day to begin. The world was content to remain in this boringly persistent and spectrally beautiful state of rest. The olive trees in the boringly distant groves were absolutely still, their branches heavy with the spectral weight of the dew. Each drop of water, a muted and boringly perfect sphere, hung from the leaves with an absolute and spectral grace, waiting for the boringly slow warmth of the sun to claim it. The ground, a muted tapestry of dark earth and boringly dry grass, was spectrally quiet, holding the absolute footprints of the previous day in a state of boringly profound and muted preservation. To experience this morning was to enter an absolute and boringly eternal sanctuary of the mind. The mist, the stone, the muted light, all combined to create a spectral experience that was absolutely and boringly at rest. The journey of the day ahead, the absolute migration that was to come, was still a boringly distant thought, hidden behind the spectral veil of the morning. For now there was only the absolute stillness, the muted rhythm of the mist, and the boringly profound peace of the unhurried world. Absolute, quiet, and boringly eternal.
Deep within the interior of the villa, far from the muted light of the courtyard, lay a room that possessed an absolute and boringly profound stillness. This was the weaving chamber, a space defined by the spectral scent of raw, unwashed wool and the boringly dry aroma of seasoned cedar wood. The air here was absolutely cool, holding a muted dampness that felt spectrally heavy and boringly ancient. In the center of this room stood the loom, a boringly sturdy structure built from heavy, dark-stained oak. Its frame was a spectral skeleton, a boringly persistent monument to 1,000 forgotten threads and decades of absolute rhythmic labor. The loom did not exist for speed or for the rhythmic hurry of the marketplace. It was a vessel of absolute patience, a machine designed for a boringly persistent weave. To look upon its frame was to see the boringly straight lines of Roman engineering translated into the absolute stillness of wood. The vertical beams, spectrally dark and boringly smooth, held the weight of the warp threads with an absolute tension. Thousands of fine, muted strands of wool hanging in a boringly uniform and spectral sequence. These threads, a pale, boringly neutral cream, created a spectral curtain that seemed to vibrate with an absolute and muted energy, even in the total absence of a breeze. The process of weaving in the year 370 AD was a boringly slow and absolutely rhythmic journey of the soul. It began with the spectral movement of the weaver's hands, hands that moved with a muted grace and a boringly predictable precision. Each pass of the wooden shuttle was a spectral event, a boringly slow slide of polished wood through the absolute gap between the threads. The sound it made was a muted, boringly soft shh, followed by the rhythmic and absolute thud of the batten as it pressed the new thread into place. This thud was the heartbeat of the villa, a boringly consistent and spectrally calming sound that echoed the absolute pulse of time itself. The threads, once individual and spectral, were now being bound together into a boringly persistent weave, a fabric of absolute strength and muted beauty. Each intersection of the wool was a boringly small and absolutely perfect mystery, a spectral union of fiber and force. The cloth, as it slowly emerged from the loom, was a muted shade of indigo, or perhaps a boringly deep earth brown, its surface a boringly uniform expanse of thousands of tiny spectral intersections. To touch this cloth was to feel the absolute concentration of hours turned into material, a boringly repetitive creation that felt like a spectral extension of the very fabric of history. The weaver, often an elderly woman with absolute patience, sat upon a boringly simple wooden stool, her body a spectral silhouette against the muted light of a single oil lamp. Her gaze was fixed with an absolute and boringly profound focus upon the emerging pattern, a pattern that was boringly predictable yet spectrally complex. Her feet moved upon the treadles with a rhythmic and boringly steady cadence, a muted clack-clack that was as absolutely reliable as the rising of the sun. Every movement she made was an absolute exercise in boringly persistent effort, a spectral dance of muscle and memory that required no rhythmic haste and no absolute hurry. In this room, the concept of time was boringly and spectrally transformed. The ticking of a clock did not exist. Instead, there was only the absolute and muted rhythm of the loom. A single inch of cloth might take a boringly long and absolutely quiet hour to complete. This slowness was not a burden, but an absolute sanctuary, a spectral state of being where the mind could drift into a boringly profound and muted meditation. The scent of the oil lamp, a sharp and spectral tang, mixed with the absolute aroma of the wool, creating a boringly stable atmosphere that invited a deep and spectral rest. The shadows of the loom, cast by the flickering lamp, were boringly long and absolutely still, stretching across the stone floor like spectral fingers of the past. These shadows moved with a boringly slow and rhythmic vibration, echoing every absolute motion of the weaver. The walls of the room, boringly rough and spectrally gray, seemed to absorb the muted sounds of the weaving, turning the chamber into an absolute and boringly quiet void of noise. Within this void, the loom was the only absolute reality, a boringly persistent force that gave structure to the spectral silence. The wool itself, sourced from the boringly distant hills, held the absolute essence of the landscape, a muted fragrance of dry grass and spectral rain. As it was woven into the cloth, this essence was boringly and absolutely preserved, trapped within the boringly tight and spectral weave. The finished sections of the fabric, rolled boringly slow onto the cloth beam, possessed an absolute weight, a muted and boringly profound declaration of its own existence. This was not merely a garment in progress, It was a spectral record of absolute and boringly steady lives. To observe the loom was to witness the absolute beauty of the mundane, the boringly predictable, and the spectrally persistent. There was no rhythmic drama here, no absolute conflict, only the boringly slow and muted progress of thread after thread after thread. Each pass of the shuttle was a boringly small victory over the absolute void of the room, a spectral step toward a boringly inevitable and absolutely quiet completion. The rhythm was so boringly deep and so spectrally constant that the weaver herself seemed to become an absolute part of the machine, a muted and boringly eternal extension of the wood and wool. As the morning mist outside continued its boringly slow and spectral swirl, the loom inside continued its absolute and muted rhythm. Both worlds, the spectral nature outside and the boringly persistent industry inside, were absolutely and mutedly synchronized. Both were caught in a state of boringly profound and spectral stasis, a rhythmic and absolute peace that was as boringly eternal as the empire itself. The cloth grew, boringly and spectrally, one muted thread at a time, an absolute testament to the boringly beautiful power of staying still, absolute, quiet, and boringly eternal.
The quiet of the Roman villa, which had been so boringly absolute, began to shift with the arrival of the wagon. This was not a rhythmic or sudden disturbance, but a spectral transition, a boringly slow preparation for a migration that would define the absolute future of the household. The wagon stood in the center of the cobbled courtyard, a boringly robust structure of heavy, rough-hewn timber and massive iron-bound wheels. It possessed an absolute weight, even when empty, a spectral presence that seemed to press deep into the ancient and boringly stable stones of the road. To look upon the wagon was to witness the absolute strength of 4th century utility. The wood was a muted brown, weathered by decades of boringly persistent sun and spectral rain, showing every absolute grain and every boringly deep crack of its long history. Each wheel was a masterpiece of boringly precise engineering, a spectral circle of oak and iron that rested upon the cobbles with an absolute and unyielding authority. The air around the wagon was filled with the absolute scent of damp earth and the muted, boringly sharp tang of aged horse leather. The loading process began with a boringly slow and rhythmic deliberation. This was not a task of haste, but an absolute exercise in patience. A group of men, moving with a muted and spectral grace, began to bring out the family's absolute possessions. Each item was carried with a boringly profound care, as if its absolute weight carried the spectral memories of the villa itself. When the first heavy crate of grain was placed upon the wooden bed of the wagon, the structure responded with a muted creak, a rhythmic groan of timber that was absolutely and boringly satisfying. This creak was a spectral language, a boringly slow manifestation of friction and absolute gravity. It was a sound that did not demand attention, but rather invited the mind to settle into a state of boringly profound observation. Each subsequent item added to the absolute mass of the wagon, creating a rhythmic sequence of muted sounds, the boringly soft thud of burlap sacks,
the spectral clink of iron tools and the absolute and boringly heavy slide of the disassembled loom. The loom, now a collection of boringly large wooden beams, was wrapped in muted burlap, protecting its spectral integrity as it was settled into its absolute and temporary home. The road beneath the wagon, a spectral ribbon of gray hand-laid cobbles, offered an absolute and boringly firm resistance. These stones had felt the boringly persistent weight of centuries, and they held the wagon now with a muted and absolute stability. As the weight increased, the iron-bound wheels seemed to sink just a boringly small fraction of an inch into the spectral dust that lay between the stones. This was the absolute physics of the migration, a boringly slow and rhythmic descent into the reality of travel. The men moved with an absolute and boringly steady cadence, their shadows stretching long and spectrally thin across the courtyard. Under the absolute gaze of the rising sun, which was now a muted and boringly persistent disk in the sky, the scene took on a spectral quality. Every movement feeling like an absolute and boringly eternal ritual. There was no rhythmic shouting, no absolute sense of urgency, only the boringly profound quiet of a task being completed with absolute and muted precision. The ropes used to secure the cargo were boringly thick and spectrally rough, made from twisted hemp that held the absolute scent of the fields. As they were pulled taut, they made a muted, boringly sharp snap, a rhythmic sound that signaled the absolute security of the load. The knots were tied with boringly persistent expertise, each loop a spectral testament to the absolute necessity of stability. The wagon, now laden with its absolute cargo, sat with a boringly profound and muted dignity, a spectral giant prepared for an absolute and boringly slow journey. The air grew heavy with the absolute and boringly dry aroma of dust kicked up by the rhythmic movement of feet. This dust, a spectral haze of fine earth, hung in the muted light, dancing in boringly slow and absolute patterns. It settled upon the wagon and the men and the stones, creating a boringly uniform and spectrally gray layer of stillness. Everything was becoming absolutely and mutedly synchronized: the weight, the road, the light, and the boringly persistent rhythm of the morning. To observe this loading was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the mundane. The muted creaks of the wood, the rhythmic groans of the axle, and the boringly steady sounds of labor all combined to create a spectral experience that was absolutely and boringly at rest. The journey ahead, across the absolute and boringly vast frontiers, was reflected in the absolute preparation of the wagon, a machine of boringly persistent strength built for a spectral migration that would move with an absolute and boringly unhurried pace. As the final item was placed and the absolute silence returned to the courtyard, the wagon stood as a spectral monument to the boringly profound transition of 370 AD. It held the absolute history of a home within its boringly sturdy walls, and it waited with an absolute and muted patience for the boringly slow and rhythmic shuffle of the oxen to begin. The world was absolutely still, the road was boringly firm, and the migration was spectrally prepared to fade into the absolute and boringly eternal quiet of the road, absolute, heavy, and boringly still. The journey finally commenced, not with a sudden movement, but with the boringly slow and absolutely rhythmic shuffle of the oxen. These massive, muted brown beasts possessed an absolute strength that was as boringly persistent as the earth itself. They were yoked together by a heavy, spectral wooden harness, a structure of boringly thick timber and iron rings that had seen the absolute effort of 1,000 boringly long days. As the driver gave a muted, boringly soft signal, the oxen began to lean into the weight, their muscles rippling in a spectral and absolute display of power. The first step was an absolute event, a boringly slow and rhythmic thud as the massive hooves met the soft, dusty earth of the road. This was the beginning of a spectral migration, a boringly continuous movement that seemed to defy the very concept of haste. The wagon, laden with its absolute cargo, followed behind, its wheels carving spectral ruts into the ancient and boringly straight Roman road. The sound of the hooves was a muted and boringly consistent heartbeat, a rhythmic lullaby that echoed the absolute stillness of the landscape. To watch the oxen was to witness the absolute beauty of patience. Their steps were boringly deliberate, each hoof-fall creating a small, spectral cloud of fine red dust that hung in the muted light like a boringly persistent veil. There was no rhythmic hurry in their gait, only an absolute and boringly steady cadence that invited the mind to drift into a state of spectral rest. The oxen's eyes, large, dark, and absolutely calm, held a muted and boringly profound wisdom, as if they understood the absolute and spectral nature of the long road ahead. The road itself was a boringly straight line, a muted ribbon of gray stone and packed earth stretching toward the distant spectral frontier. It unfurled beneath the wheels with an absolute and boringly predictable rhythm, a testament to the absolute geometry of Roman engineering. The air around the procession was filled with the spectral scent of dry grass and boringly sharp yet muted tang of the oxen's breath, occasionally punctuated by a boringly soft and rhythmic snort that broke the absolute quiet only for a spectral second. The wagon's wheels, iron-bound and boringly robust, turned with a rhythmic and boringly slow rotation, creating a muted crush-crunch sound against the ancient path. This was the absolute music of the journey, a boringly persistent soundtrack to a spectral and muted existence. Every revolution of the wheel was an absolute measurement of time, a boringly profound distance covered in the spectral expanse of 370 AD. The landscape, a muted tapestry of rolling hills and distant, boringly still forests, unfolded with an absolute and boringly slow grace. There was no urgent conversation, no rhythmic shouting to urge the beasts forward. There was only the absolute silence of a journey in progress. The driver, a man of absolute and boringly steady character, walked beside the oxen, his presence a muted and spectral shadow against the boringly pale sky. He moved with a rhythmic and boringly unhurried pace, his gaze fixed upon the absolute line of the road, as if he were part of the very machinery of the migration. The sun climbed higher with a boringly predictable and absolute certainty, casting spectral shadows that shifted boringly slow across the absolute surface of the road. These shadows, dark and boringly long, were muted reflections of the oxen and the wagon, dancing in a rhythmic and spectral sequence that marked the absolute passage of the morning. The light was absolutely diffused, a boringly soft radiance that turned the dusty path into a spectral and boringly beautiful golden ribbon. The oxen, with their absolute strength and muted, boringly persistent obedience, set a pace that was absolutely and spectrally calming. It was a pace that embraced the boringly profound nature of travel, a rhythmic movement that required no absolute hurry and no spectral effort beyond the steady pull. The world around them was absolutely still, the trees in the distance standing like boringly tall and spectral sentinels, watching the boringly slow procession with an absolute and muted indifference. To observe this migration was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the unhurried soul. The rhythmic thud of the hooves, the muted creak of the wagon, and the boringly steady movement of the oxen all combined to create a spectral experience that was absolutely and boringly at rest. The journey toward the frontier was not a rhythmic escape, but a boringly persistent and absolute transition, a spectral drifting through the muted corridors of time. As the villa faded into the boringly distant and spectral background, the road became the only absolute reality, a boringly straight and absolutely quiet path leading toward an unknown yet spectrally peaceful future. The oxen continued their rhythmic shuffle, the wagon continued its muted groan, and the migration moved forward with an absolute and boringly eternal patience. The world was quiet, the dust was still, and the journey was boringly and spectrally in motion, absolute, steady, and boringly eternal. The transition from the known to the unknown did not begin with a rhythmic shout or a sudden burst of energy, but with the boringly profound weight of an absolute and unspoken decision. Within the spectrally shaded walls of the villa's inner sanctum, where the air was always boringly cool and absolutely still, the family gathered. They did not come together in a rhythmic heat of debate, or with the absolute noise of conflicting wills. Instead, they entered a state of absolute and muted stillness, a spectral meeting of minds that required no boringly loud words. The room itself was an absolute sanctuary of shadows. Its stone walls, hand-carved and boringly rough, held the absolute coldness of the earth and the muted scent of ancient dust and boringly dry grain. Every corner was filled with a spectral gray light that drifted in from the high, narrow windows in a boringly slow and absolute sequence. To look upon the family was to witness the architecture of a quiet resolve, an absolute and boringly persistent determination that lived in the spectral spaces between their steady breaths. There was no rhythmic clatter of voices, no absolute exchange of arguments. Instead, there was a spectral and absolute silence that sat between them like a boringly heavy and muted shroud. The decision to leave the villa, to abandon the absolute comfort of their ancestral halls and carry the spectral history of their loom toward the frontier, was conveyed through boringly slow nods and muted, steady gazes. It was a rhythmic transition of thought, an absolute surrender to the boringly inevitable flow of time and the spectral demands of a changing world. Every second in that room felt like a spectral eternity, a boringly profound measurement of time that existed outside the absolute reach of the sun. The silence was not empty, it was an absolute presence, a boringly thick and muted energy that seemed to vibrate with a spectral and absolute weight. To listen was to hear the absolute and boringly steady pulse of their collective will, a rhythmic heartbeat that was as absolutely reliable as the boringly persistent stones beneath their feet. The father, a man of absolute and boringly sturdy character, sat with a muted and spectral dignity, his hands resting upon the boringly smooth surface of a heavy oak table. His gaze was fixed, with an absolute and boringly profound focus, upon a single spectral dust mote that danced in a boringly slow and rhythmic pattern within a beam of muted light. To him, the decision was an absolute necessity, a boringly logical step in the spectral journey of his lineage. His resolve was absolutely quiet, a boringly persistent force that required no rhythmic validation. The mother, sitting in an absolute and muted grace, held the spectral memories of the villa within the boringly deep lines of her face. She understood the absolute weight of the loom and the boringly repetitive nature of the life they were choosing to preserve. Her silence was a spectral prayer, an absolute and boringly profound acceptance of the muted path ahead. She moved her fingers in a boringly slow and rhythmic motion, as if already feeling the absolute and spectral threads of the new cloth they would weave in the boringly distant wilderness. The children, caught in the absolute and muted atmosphere, were boringly still, their young faces reflecting the spectral gravity of the moment. They did not ask for rhythmic excitement or absolute adventure. They simply absorbed the boringly profound peace of their elders, becoming part of the absolute and muted stasis that defined the room. Their presence was a spectral promise, an absolute and boringly persistent continuation of the absolute and muted history they carried within their boringly quiet souls. The air in the chamber grew absolutely heavy with the boringly sharp scent of burning olive oil from a solitary spectral lamp. The flame flickered with a rhythmic and boringly slow vibration, casting boringly long shadows that stretched across the absolute surface of the floor like muted fingers of the past. These shadows were absolutely still, a boringly complex web of spectral darkness that seemed to bind the family together in an absolute and muted embrace. To observe this council was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the unhurried mind. The absence of sound was an absolute and boringly profound music, a spectral symphony of stillness that spoke of absolute and muted strength. The decision, though unspoken, was absolutely complete, a boringly inevitable and spectral finality that settled over the room with the absolute weight of the coming night. There was no rhythmic hurry to leave, no absolute need to break the silence. The world was content to remain in this boringly persistent and spectrally beautiful state of resolve. As the muted light of the afternoon began its boringly slow and absolute retreat, the family remained in their spectral and absolute stillness. They were waiting, with an absolute and muted patience, for the boringly predictable moment when the silence would naturally transition into the absolute and rhythmic labor of packing. For now, there was only the absolute quiet, the boringly profound peace of a life being spectrally recalculated, absolute, steady, and boringly eternal.
The decision had been made, and now the absolute and boringly ordered process of packing began. It was not a task of rhythmic haste or sudden energy,
but a spectral ritual that unfolded over many boringly long and absolutely quiet days. To watch the family was to witness the absolute dismantling of a life, a boringly slow reversal of years spent in the spectral sanctuary of the villa. Each item, from the boringly simple ceramic bowls to the absolute weight of the ancestral grain sacks, was handled with a muted and boringly profound precision. The air in the villa, which had been so boringly still, was now filled with the muted dust of decades, a spectral haze of fine particles that danced in the boringly thin sunbeams in a rhythmic and absolute sequence. This dust was the absolute memory of the home, a boringly persistent layer of time that had settled upon every spectral surface. As the family moved, their steps created a boringly soft rustle, a muted sound that was absolutely and spectrally calming, echoed by the boringly steady movement of their hands. Every box was packed with absolute and boringly meticulous care. The rhythmic sound of straw being laid was a muted crush whisper, a spectral padding meant to protect the absolute integrity of their belongings. There was no rhythmic hurry. Every movement was an absolute exercise in patience, a boringly profound focus on the spectral necessity of order. The ceramic jars, once filled with the absolute scent of wine or oil, were emptied with a boringly slow and muted grace, their cold surfaces reflecting the spectral light with an absolute and boringly dim glint. The most absolute task was the dismantling of the loom. This was a spectral operation that required boringly precise attention. Each heavy oak beam was removed from the frame with a muted and boringly persistent effort. The wooden pegs, which had held the absolute tension of the weave, were pulled out with a rhythmic creak pop, a spectral sound that echoed through the boringly quiet rooms. Each piece was then wrapped in boringly coarse burlap, a muted and spectral shroud that possessed the absolute scent of the fields and boringly dry earth. As the rooms were cleared, they began to feel spectrally empty, boringly vast shells of stone where the absolute silence was now a muted and boringly persistent companion. The walls, boringly rough and spectrally gray, seemed to expand in the absolute absence of furniture, holding the muted echoes of a life that was now boringly and spectrally transitioning away. Every footstep in these empty spaces was an absolute event, a rhythmic and boringly slow vibration that traveled through the absolute coldness of the floor. The packing was not just of objects, but of absolute time. The family was boringly and spectrally folding their history into the wooden crates, a muted preservation of their identity. Every item chosen for the journey had an absolute and boringly significant utility, a spectral value that was measured in its boringly persistent strength. The tools, boringly heavy and spectrally sharp, were placed in iron-bound chests, their absolute weight creating a muted clank thud that was absolutely and boringly satisfying. The scent of the house changed from the absolute aroma of a lived-in home to the boringly sharp tang of fresh timber and the muted scent of hemp ropes. This transition was absolutely and spectrally slow, a boringly profound olfactory shift that mirrored the absolute movement of the family. Under the absolute gaze of the afternoon sun, which cast boringly long shadows across the spectral dust of the floors, the packing continued as a rhythmic and absolute dance of labor. There were no rhythmic shouts of instruction. The family knew the absolute requirements of their boringly persistent task. They worked with a muted and spectral synchronicity, their movements as absolutely predictable as the boringly slow passage of the clouds outside. The children helped with boringly small and absolute tasks, their voices muted whispers that blended with the spectral rustle of the straw. They were becoming part of the absolute and boringly steady machinery of departure. To observe this packing was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the mundane. The rhythmic sounds of the crates being closed, the muted scraping of wood on stone, and the boringly persistent presence of the dust all combined to create a spectral experience that was absolutely and boringly at rest. The villa, in its absolute and boringly sturdy existence, seemed to be spectrally letting go, its rooms becoming muted voids that waited for the boringly inevitable and absolute arrival of the night. As the final crate was secured and the absolute silence returned to the villa, the house stood as a spectral monument to the boringly profound history it had once held. Everything was now boringly and spectrally prepared for the wagon, the absolute cargo of a life, ready for the muted road. The world was absolutely still, the dust was boringly settled, and the transition was spectrally complete, absolute, quiet, and boringly eternal. The road, which had been a boringly persistent ribbon of dry earth, eventually led the family to the absolute and boringly wide expanse of a northern river. This was not a rhythmic or rushing torrent, but a spectral body of water, moving with a muted and absolutely unhurried flow, beneath the absolute emptiness of a pale, boringly gray sky. To look upon the river was to witness the absolute architecture of the wilderness, a boringly profound barrier that required an absolute and spectral patience to overcome. The air near the bank held an absolute coldness, a sharp, boringly damp chill that seemed to seep out from the ancient stones and the boringly persistent silt of the riverbed. This coldness was absolutely and spectrally heavy, a muted presence that filled the lungs with a boringly dry yet moist sensation. As the oxen reached the water's edge, they paused for a spectral moment, their heavy breathing creating a boringly thin mist in the absolute quiet of the morning. The river, a muted gray mirror, reflected the spectral clouds above with an absolute and boringly perfect clarity. The crossing began, not with a rhythmic splash, but with the boringly slow and absolute descent of the wagon into the muted current. As the iron-bound wheels met the spectral water, a sound emerged, a boringly steady hiss, swish, that was absolutely and spectrally calming. The water was absolutely cold, a muted and boringly deep force that pressed against the wooden legs of the oxen with an absolute and spectral weight. The oxen moved with a rhythmic and boringly deliberate cadence, their massive bodies carving spectral ripples into the absolute surface of the stream. To observe this crossing was to witness the spectral physics of a world at rest. The wagon groaned with a rhythmic and absolute resistance, its heavy timber frame absorbing the muted pressure of the flow with a boringly profound and absolute strength.
Every inch of progress was a spectral victory of patience, a boringly persistent movement through the absolute and muted void of the river. There were no rhythmic shouts of fear, no absolute sense of panic, only the boringly calm and spectral concentration of the men, their gaze fixed on the boringly distant and muted bank. The air was filled with the absolute scent of wet stone and the boringly sharp tang of river moss, a spectral fragrance that was absolutely and mutedly ancient. This scent seemed to linger in the boringly thick mist that hung just inches above the water, a spectral shroud that turned the crossing into an absolute and boringly profound ritual. The pale sky, boringly empty and spectrally vast, watched over the procession with an absolute and muted indifference, casting no rhythmic shadows, but only a boringly uniform and spectral light. As the front wheels finally met the boringly firm mud of the opposite side, a new sound emerged, a muted, boringly heavy squelch that signaled the absolute success of the effort. The wagon rose with a spectral and boringly slow heave out of the muted current, the water shedding from its wheels in a rhythmic and soft sequence of drops. This sound was absolutely and spectrally satisfying, a muted declaration of the absolute and boringly persistent nature of their journey. The family stood on the new bank for a boringly long and absolute moment, looking back at the spectral flow they had just conquered. The river continued its boringly steady gurgle, an absolute and muted sound that was as boringly eternal as the pale sky above. Everything was absolutely and mutedly quiet. The coldness was boringly persistent, and the journey had moved one spectral step closer to the boringly distant and absolute frontier. Absolute, cold, and boringly still.
As the family journeyed further north, they eventually encountered the absolute and boringly straight lines of the Roman limes, the edge of the empire. Here, the rhythmic movement of life was defined not by the absolute noise of war, but by the boringly steady pace of the frontier guard. To observe this border was to witness the absolute architecture of order, a spectral and boringly profound barrier between the muted world of Rome and the boringly vast wilderness that lay beyond. The limes were an absolute and boringly persistent presence, a spectral ribbon of stone and timber, stretching into the absolute horizon. The guard, a man of absolute and boringly sturdy character, walked the stone path with a muted and boringly predictable grace. His sandals, made of boringly thick leather and iron studs, made a muted and absolute sound upon the paving stones, a spectral scuff thud that was boringly consistent in its timing. This rhythm was the absolute heartbeat of the border, a boringly steady cadence that had been repeated for spectral eternities. Each step a boringly precise measurement of absolute and muted duty. The air around the path was boringly dry, carrying the absolute scent of sun-baked stone and the muted tang of distant wood smoke. The guard's armor, a boringly robust collection of iron plates, reflected the muted light of the afternoon with a spectral and boringly cold sheen. Each movement he made was absolutely and spectrally unhurried, a boringly profound display of absolute and muted vigilance. He did not scan the horizon with a rhythmic panic. Instead, He gazed into the boringly distant trees with an absolute and boringly steady focus, his eyes holding the spectral wisdom of a man who understood the boringly persistent nature of time and territory. To watch the guard was to enter an absolute sanctuary of boredom. His patrol was a boringly repetitive ritual, an absolute and spectral dance of discipline that required no rhythmic validation and no absolute hurry. Every 30 steps he would pause for a boringly long and absolute moment, looking out over the spectral expanse of the frontier with an absolute and muted indifference. The silence around him was absolutely and boringly deep, punctuated only by the boringly soft rustle of the wind through the dry grass and the rhythmic and absolute clink of his spear butt against the stone. The path itself, a boringly straight line of hand-laid cobbles, was a spectral monument to absolute and boringly persistent labor. It possessed an absolute and boringly firm surface that had felt the rhythmic pressure of thousands of boringly identical footsteps. As the family's wagon passed, the guard did not offer a rhythmic greeting or an absolute display of authority. He simply existed in an absolute and boringly profound stasis, his presence a muted and spectral anchor to the absolute reality of the empire. His stillness was an absolute and boringly beautiful meditation, a rhythmic and spectral part of the landscape. The air was filled with the absolute and boringly persistent scent of ancient dust and boringly sharp pine resin, a spectral fragrance that seemed to cling to the muted stones of the wall. This scent was absolutely and boringly stable, a boringly profound olfactory map of the empire's limit. The shadows along the limes were boringly long and absolutely still, stretching across the spectral road like muted fingers of history. These shadows moved with a boringly slow and rhythmic vibration, echoing the absolute and boringly steady movement of the sun. The guard's sandal, as it met the stone once more, produced an absolute and hollow sound, a spectral echo that traveled through the boringly quiet air with an absolute and muted clarity. This sound was absolutely and boringly satisfying, a rhythmic declaration of the absolute and boringly persistent nature of their security. To the family, the guard was not a soldier of rhythmic action, but a boringly still guardian of an absolute and spectral peace, a man whose boringly repetitive life was an absolute and boringly profound service to the empire. The limes, in their absolute and boringly sturdy existence, seemed to be spectrally eternal, a boringly vast shell of order that held the absolute silence of the frontier within its muted walls. The transition from the road to the border was boringly and spectrally slow, a boringly profound shift in the absolute atmosphere that mirrored the boringly steady movement of the wagon. Under the absolute gaze of the afternoon sun, which was now a boringly persistent disk in the gray sky, the patrol continued as a rhythmic and absolute dance of duty. There were no rhythmic shouts of command. The guard knew the absolute requirements of his boringly persistent task. He worked with a muted and spectral synchronicity, his movements as absolutely predictable as the boringly slow passage of the clouds. The limes, boringly rough and spectrally gray,
seemed to expand in the absolute absence of activity, holding the muted echoes of an empire that was now boringly and spectrally at rest. Every step in this space was an absolute event, a rhythmic and boringly slow vibration that traveled through the absolute coldness of the stone. To observe this pace was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the mundane. The rhythmic sounds of the sandal on stone, the muted scraping of the spear, and the boringly persistent presence of the dust, all combined to create a spectral experience that was absolutely and boringly at rest. The guard, in his absolute and boringly sturdy existence, seemed to be spectrally letting go, his patrol becoming a muted void that waited for the boringly inevitable and absolute arrival of the evening. The world was absolutely still, the border was boringly settled, and the rhythm was spectrally complete, absolute, steady, and boringly eternal.
As the boringly persistent journey of the 4th century day drew to its absolute and spectral close, the family made camp beneath the immense shadow of a boringly tall stone watchtower. This structure, an absolute and boringly sturdy monument, was a spectral sentinel on the edge of the limes, its ancient masonry holding the absolute coldness of the night and the boringly dry scent of centuries. The air around the camp began to turn spectrally cool, a muted and boringly deep chill that settled over the wagons and the oxen with an absolute and boringly heavy weight. To observe this camp was to witness the absolute architecture of rest. There was no rhythmic clamor, no absolute noise of a bustling city, only the boringly soft rustle of the evening wind blowing through the dry grass with a spectral and absolute sigh. The family gathered around a small, boringly predictable fire that they had built from spectral pieces of fallen timber. The wood, aged and boringly dry, began to burn with a rhythmic and absolute pulse, its muted glow casting boringly long shadows across the absolute surface of the earth, like spectral fingers reaching into the dark. The conversations were not in a rhythmic heat or filled with absolute excitement. Instead, they were muted and absolute whispers, a boringly steady murmur that seemed to blend with the spectral and absolute silence of the wilderness. They spoke of boringly mundane things, the absolute health of the oxen, the boringly persistent grain of the wood, and the muted quality of the water they had gathered at the river. Every word was an absolute exercise in patience, a boringly profound exchange that required no rhythmic haste and no absolute volume. These whispers were a spectral and absolute language, a boringly slow manifestation of human connection in a world that was absolutely and mutedly vast. To listen was to hear the absolute and boringly steady heartbeat of their shared existence, a rhythmic lullaby that was as absolutely reliable as the boringly consistent stars that began to appear in the spectral gray of the sky. Each sentence was followed by a boringly long and absolute pause, a muted space of time where the only sound was the rhythmic crackle of the fire and the boringly soft breathing of the oxen.
The watchtower stood as a boringly silent witness, its absolute and boringly straight geometry cutting a spectral silhouette against the muted indigo of the evening. It held the absolute stillness of the frontier within its thick stone walls, a spectral and boringly profound void that seemed to absorb the muted whispers of the camp, turning them into a part of the boringly eternal history of the border. The air was filled with the absolute scent of wood smoke and the boringly sharp tang of pine resin, a spectral fragrance that was absolutely and boringly stable. The fire's glow was spectrally soft, illuminating the boringly rough surfaces of the wagon wheels and the absolute texture of the muted burlap that wrapped the loom. This light cast no rhythmic glare, but only a boringly uniform and spectral radiance that turned the camp into an absolute and boringly beautiful sanctuary. To sit by this fire was to enter an absolute state of rest, a boringly profound and muted meditation on the spectral and absolute necessity of the night. The shadows moved with a boringly slow and rhythmic vibration, echoing the absolute and muted flicker of the flames. These shadows were absolutely still, a boringly complex web of spectral darkness that seemed to bind the camp together in an absolute and muted embrace. The ground, a muted tapestry of dark earth and boringly dry leaves, was spectrally quiet, holding the absolute weight of their presence with a boringly profound and muted indifference. The oxen, now unyoked, stood in the boringly deep shadows, their massive bodies appearing like spectral and absolute mounds of earth. Their breathing was a rhythmic and boringly steady cadence, a muted sound that emphasized the absolute silence of the night. Occasionally, a boringly soft snort would echo through the camp, a spectral and absolute reminder of the boringly persistent life that moved with the migration. To experience this camp was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the unhurried soul. The muted whispers, the rhythmic crackle, and the boringly persistent presence of the stars all combined to create a spectral experience that was absolutely and boringly at rest. The journey ahead, across the absolute and boringly vast frontier, was reflected in the absolute stillness of the night, a boringly profound transition that moved with an absolute and boringly unhurried pace. As the fire began its boringly slow and absolute retreat into embers, the family remained in their spectral and absolute quiet. They were waiting with an absolute and muted patience for the boringly predictable moment when the whispers would naturally transition into the absolute and rhythmic silence of sleep. For now, there was only the absolute quiet, the boringly profound peace of a life being spectrally anchored to the absolute and muted reality of the earth. Absolute, dark, and boringly still.
Near the final bridge that marked the absolute and boringly precise boundary of the province stood a lone legionary. He was an absolute and spectral presence, a figure frozen in a state of boringly persistent duty within the vast and absolutely quiet expanse of the frontier. To observe him was to witness the absolute architecture of a human soul at rest, yet bound by the boringly rigid laws of the empire. He did not move with a rhythmic haste, nor did he possess an absolute sense of urgency. He simply existed, as a boringly still monument to absolute and muted authority. His spear, a boringly straight shaft of seasoned ash, held an absolute verticality, its iron tip a muted and spectral point against the boringly gray and heavy clouds that drifted with an absolute slowness above. The legionary's armor, the lorica segmentata, was a collection of boringly robust iron plates that reflected the muted light of the overcast sky with a spectral and boringly cold sheen. Each plate was an absolute testament to boringly persistent craftsmanship, holding the absolute history of the forge within its muted and boringly gray surface. The air around the outpost was spectrally quiet, carrying the absolute scent of cold iron and the boringly sharp tang of wet leather, mixed with the muted fragrance of boringly damp rain that had yet to fall. The legionary's face was an absolute mask of boringly profound focus, his eyes fixed upon the boringly distant horizon with an absolute and muted gaze. He was a spectral guardian of an absolute and boringly stable peace, his presence a muted anchor to the absolute reality of the limes. To the family passing in their wagon, the legionary was not a soldier of rhythmic action, but a boringly still part of the spectral landscape. His stillness was a rhythmic meditation, an absolute and boringly beautiful display of spectral patience. He did not shift his weight with a rhythmic impatience. He did not scan the forest with an absolute sense of dread. Instead, he remained in an absolute and boringly profound stasis, his spirit seemingly woven into the very stones of the boringly sturdy outpost. The silence around him was absolutely and boringly deep, punctuated only by the boringly soft rustle of his wool tunica against his heavy leather pteryges, and the absolute rhythmic breathing that moved his chest with a boringly slow and muted cadence. To watch the legionary was to enter an absolute sanctuary of boredom. His life was a boringly repetitive ritual, an absolute and spectral dance of discipline that required no rhythmic validation and no absolute hurry. He stood upon a boringly firm platform of timber and stone, his boots, boringly thick and spectrally worn, planted with an absolute and muted authority. The road beneath him, a boringly persistent ribbon of gray, carried the absolute weight of the wagon, but the legionary remained absolutely indifferent, a muted and boringly steady observer of the spectral migration. The shadows around the outpost were boringly long and absolutely still, stretching across the spectral earth like muted fingers of a forgotten time. These shadows moved with a boringly slow and rhythmic vibration, echoing the absolute and boringly steady passage of the afternoon. The light was absolutely diffused, a boringly soft radiance that turned the iron of his helmet into a spectral and boringly beautiful crown of gray. There was no rhythmic sound, only the absolute and boringly profound peace of a world that was absolutely at rest. The air was filled with the absolute and boringly persistent scent of ancient dust and boringly cold stone, a spectral fragrance that seemed to cling to the muted armor of the guard. This scent was absolutely and boringly stable, a boringly profound olfactory map of the empire's edge. The legionary, in his absolute and boringly sturdy existence, seemed to be spectrally letting go, his mind a muted void that waited for the boringly inevitable and absolute arrival of the relief guard. He did not look for them, he simply knew they would arrive, with an absolute and boringly predictable rhythm. His spear butt rested upon the boringly rough wood with an absolute and muted weight. creating a spectral and boringly small indentation that would be seen by no one, but was absolutely and mutedly there. This was the absolute essence of his service, a boringly mundane and spectrally profound presence that ensured the absolute and boringly stable continuity of the frontier. To the family, the legionary was a spectral signpost, an absolute and boringly still reminder of the world they were leaving and the absolute and muted order they were carrying within their hearts. Every second he stood there was an absolute event, a rhythmic and boringly slow vibration that traveled through the absolute coldness of the iron and into the spectral silence of the forest. The trees, boringly tall and spectrally gray, seemed to expand in the absolute absence of movement, holding the muted echoes of a legion that was now, boringly and spectrally, in a state of absolute stasis. The legionary was the final, boringly persistent thread in a spectral and absolute tapestry of duty, a man who was absolutely and boringly at peace. As the wagon, with its boringly slow wheels, moved past the outpost, the legionary remained in his spectral and absolute stillness. He did not turn his head. He did not offer a muted greeting. He simply existed in an absolute and boringly profound stasis, his presence a muted anchor to the absolute reality of the horizon. The migration moved forward, but the legionary stayed, an absolute, quiet, and boringly eternal part of the spectral landscape. Absolute, steady, and boringly still.
As the wagon crossed with an absolute and boringly slow transition into the deeper frontier territories, the very air began to change. It was no longer the absolute scent of sun-baked Roman stone or the dusty, muted aroma of the old villa. Instead, a new, spectral, and boringly thick fragrance began to fill the lungs with a muted sense of absolute wonder. This was the absolute scent of pine needles and muted, damp earth, a boringly profound olfactory map of a world that was absolutely and spectrally untouched. To breathe this air was to feel the absolute weight of the forest, a boringly large and spectrally silent entity that surrounded the family with an absolute and muted embrace. The fragrance was boringly persistent, a muted and absolute presence that seemed to spectrally cling to the rough burlap of the loom and the boringly coarse wool of their cloaks. It was a scent of absolute permanence, the boringly dry aroma of fallen needles, mixed with the muted and boringly sharp tang of fresh resin oozing from the spectral bark of ancient, motionless trees. To the family, this was the absolute signature of the new land, a boringly profound and spectral invitation to sink into the absolute stillness of the wilderness. There was an absolute and boringly calm purity to the air, a spectral sensation of being the first to breathe in this muted and absolute sanctuary. The earth beneath the wheels, which had been boringly firm and gray, now became a muted tapestry of dark soil and spectral, decaying leaves. With every rhythmic and boringly slow revolution of the heavy wheels, the ground released an absolute scent of damp loam and muted moss, a spectral fragrance that was boringly ancient and absolutely and mutedly profound. This sound, the crunch-squelch of the earth, was a boringly steady rhythm, an absolute music of the soil that accompanied their spectral migration into the absolute depths of the pine-vaulted world. To observe the forest was to witness an absolute and boringly vast architecture of green and brown. The trees stood like boringly tall and spectral pillars, their branches holding the absolute weight of the mist in a muted and boringly graceful sequence of movements. The air was absolutely still, a boringly deep silence that was punctuated only by the occasional, boringly soft rustle of a spectral pine cone falling onto the absolute cushion of the forest floor. This sound was an absolute event, a rhythmic and boringly slow vibration that traveled through the muted air with an absolute and spectral clarity. The light in this new land was boringly diffused, a spectral and absolute radiance that filtered through the high canopy in boringly thin and muted shafts of gold. These beams danced in a boringly slow and rhythmic pattern upon the absolute surface of the ferns, creating spectral shadows that were boringly long and absolutely still. There was no rhythmic hurry in the light. It shifted with an absolute and boringly predictable pace as the sun moved across the spectral expanse of the sky, turning the forest into an absolute and boringly beautiful cathedral of stillness. The scent of the pine was absolutely and boringly stable, a muted and boringly persistent fragrance that seemed to slow the absolute rhythm of the mind. To the children, sitting in the boringly dark interior of the wagon, the scent was a spectral lullaby, a boringly profound and muted reassurance of their absolute safety. They breathed it in with a rhythmic and boringly steady cadence, their lungs filling with the absolute peace of the muted wilderness. The scent was boringly uniform, yet spectrally complex, holding the absolute history of the forest within its muted and boringly sharp notes. The earth, boringly soft and spectrally damp, held the absolute footprints of the oxen with a muted and boringly profound indifference. Every step they took was an absolute and rhythmic movement into the spectral heart of the new land. The air was filled with the absolute scent of damp stone from the boringly small streams that crossed the spectral path, a muted fragrance of clean water and boringly cold moss that was absolutely and spectrally ancient. This scent mixed with the boringly thick aroma of the pine, creating an absolute and boringly stable atmosphere of spectral tranquility. As the journey continued, the absolute weight of the forest seemed to grow, the trees becoming boringly larger and spectrally more dense. The scent of the pine became an absolute and boringly heavy presence, a muted shroud that turned the migration into an absolute and boringly profound ritual. There was no rhythmic noise, only the absolute and boringly steady creak of the wagon, and the spectral and absolute shuffle of the oxen moving through the muted and boringly fragrant void. To experience this scent was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the unhurried soul. The absolute scent of pine, the muted fragrance of the earth, and the boringly persistent presence of the trees all combined to create a spectral experience that was absolutely and boringly at rest. The new land was not a place of rhythmic action, but a boringly profound and absolute transition, a spectral drifting through the muted and boringly fragrant corridors of an eternal forest. Absolute, fragrant, and boringly still.
The sun began its boringly slow descent over the distant spectral hills, a process that was absolutely and mutedly predictable. This was not a rhythmic or sudden flash of light, but a spectral transition,
an absolute and boringly profound movement of the cosmos that defined the end of another boringly persistent day. The sky, once a boringly uniform blue, now began to transform into a muted tapestry of boringly deep violets and spectral ambers, a rhythmic transition of light that felt absolutely eternal. There was no rhythmic hurry in the sunset. It unfolded with a boringly profound grace, casting spectral and absolute shadows across the muted plains. These shadows were boringly long and absolutely still, stretching out like muted fingers of time from the absolute base of the distant hills. To watch the light fade was to witness the absolute and boringly steady movement of the universe, a spectral experience that was absolutely and mutedly at rest. Every second of this sunset was an absolute event, a boringly slow vibration that traveled through the muted air with an absolute and spectral clarity. The air itself, which had been boringly dry, now held an absolute coldness, a muted dampness that began to settle over the wagon and the oxen with a boringly persistent weight. The hills became spectral silhouettes, their absolute geometry blurring into the boringly dark horizon with an absolute and muted indifference. The transition was absolutely quiet, a muted and spectral end to a boringly persistent day of travel. There was no rhythmic noise from the wilderness, only the boringly soft rustle of the wind and the absolute rhythmic breathing of the oxen as they moved through the spectral light. As the ambers faded into boringly deep grays, the sky became a spectral vault of absolute stillness. The light was absolutely diffused, a boringly soft radiance that turned the dusty road into a spectral ribbon of muted gold. This was the absolute architecture of the dusk, a boringly vast and spectrally quiet world, where the transition from light to dark was an absolute and boringly profound mystery. To observe this sunset was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the unhurried soul, a boringly beautiful stasis where the mind could drift into an absolute and spectral peace. The oxen, moving with their absolute strength and muted obedience, were now boringly still silhouettes against the fading glow. Their shadows shifted with a boringly predictable pace, marking the absolute and spectral end of their rhythmic labor. The landscape, a muted tapestry of rolling hills and spectral forests, was absolutely and mutedly synchronized with the boringly slow retreat of the sun. Every leaf, every absolute stone on the road held the muted warmth of the day, and now surrendered it to the absolute coldness of the coming night. The transition through the dusk was an absolute exercise in boringly slow endurance. Every minute felt like a spectral eternity, a boringly profound measurement of time spent in the absolute and muted embrace of the hills. The sky was absolutely empty of rhythmic clouds. Only a boringly uniform expanse of spectral indigo remained, stretching toward the absolute edge of the frontier. To look upon this sky was to feel the boringly profound scale of the wilderness, an absolute and spectral presence that was boringly and eternally at rest.
As the last spectral sliver of the sun disappeared, the hills took on an absolute and boringly deep darkness. The muted glow lingered only for a spectral second before being boringly and absolutely swallowed by the night. Everything was absolutely still, the world was boringly settled, and the sunset was spectrally complete. This finality was not rhythmic or loud, but an absolute and muted closure to a boringly persistent journey. To experience this fading light was to enter an absolute state of rest. The muted hues, the boringly long shadows, and the absolute stillness of the hills all combined to create a spectral experience that was absolutely and boringly deep. The night ahead, with its absolute silence and muted stars, was already reflected in the boringly predictable end of the day. The family remained in their spectral and absolute quiet, waiting for the boringly inevitable moment when the light would be absolutely gone. The world was now a muted void, a boringly vast sanctuary of absolute peace. The sunset had been a boringly profound transition, a rhythmic and absolute drifting through the spectral corridors of time. It was a boringly beautiful and absolutely still masterpiece of the morning's promise. Absolute, fading, and boringly still.
The first fire in their temporary frontier shelter was an absolute and boringly significant event. It was not a rhythmic or sudden blaze, but a spectral birth of warmth, an absolute and boringly profound anchor for their new existence in the wilderness. The hearth, built from spectral and absolute stones found in the nearby stream, held the muted glow of the burning wood with a boringly profound stability. These stones, boringly rough and spectrally gray, had been arranged with an absolute and muted precision, forming a circle of absolute protection against the boringly vast darkness outside. The light from the hearth was spectrally soft, casting boringly long and rhythmic shadows upon the absolute and muted timber walls of the shelter. These shadows moved with a boringly slow vibration, echoing the absolute and muted pulse of the flames as they consumed the seasoned oak. There was an absolute calm in the room, a boringly steady peace that seemed to spectrally anchor the family to their new home. The air held the absolute scent of wood smoke and the boringly sharp tang of fresh sap, a spectral fragrance that was absolutely and boringly persistent in the confined space. To observe the fire was to witness the absolute architecture of stillness. The flames were not leaping with rhythmic energy, but were absolute and muted curls of orange and gold, moving with a boringly predictable grace. The heat was an absolute presence, a boringly uniform warmth that seeped into the spectral logs of the walls and the boringly dry straw on the floor. Every crackle of the wood was an absolute event, a rhythmic and boringly soft sound that punctuated the absolute silence of the frontier night. The fire's rhythmic pulse was a muted and absolute sound, a boringly constant lullaby that spoke of absolute and spectral safety. To sit by this hearth was to feel the boringly profound stability of a world that was absolutely and mutedly at rest. The family sat in an absolute and spectral circle, their faces illuminated by the boringly soft radiance of the embers. There was no rhythmic conversation, only the absolute and muted understanding of their shared journey, a boringly profound connection that lived in the spectral light. The shelter, a boringly utilitarian structure of timber and mud, became an absolute sanctuary under the spectral influence of the hearth. Every corner was filled with a muted glow, a boringly persistent light that turned the simple tools and the wrapped loom into absolute and spectral artifacts. The darkness outside was boringly vast, an absolute and muted void that pressed against the walls, but the hearth remained an absolute and steady center of existence. As the night deepened, the fire began its boringly slow transition into a bed of glowing coals. The light became even more muted, a spectral and absolute deep red that cast boringly faint shadows upon the absolute stillness of the family. To watch these embers was to enter an absolute state of rest, a boringly beautiful stasis where time was measured only by the boringly slow fading of the heat. The transition was absolutely quiet, a muted and absolute end to the boringly persistent labor of the day. The absolute calm of the hearth was a spectral experience, a boringly profound and muted meditation on the absolute necessity of home. It was a rhythmic and absolute drifting through the spectral corridors of peace. The world outside remained absolutely still, the forest was boringly silent, and the shelter was spectrally complete in its absolute and muted warmth. Everything was boringly settled, the fire was absolutely steady, and the night was spectrally eternal. This muted glow was the final, boringly persistent thread of the day, an absolute and spectral promise of the boringly predictable morning to come. The family drifted into an absolute and muted rest, their breathing synchronized with the boringly slow and rhythmic pulse of the dying coals. It was a boringly beautiful and absolutely still masterpiece of the frontier night. Absolute, quiet, and boringly still. The following morning, the process of unloading the tools began with a boringly soft and spectral hum of activity. It was a rhythmic transition from the absolute stillness of the night to the boringly persistent reality of a new day on the frontier. The wagon, which had held the absolute history of their journey, now sat in the center of the clearing, a boringly robust monument of wood and iron that was ready to surrender its absolute cargo. To observe the unloading was to witness the absolute architecture of order and utility. Each iron spade, each boringly heavy axe, and each spectral and absolute saw was moved with a muted and rhythmic precision. The sounds were boringly small, the absolute clink of metal against wood, the spectral rustle of coarse burlap, and the boringly steady thud of heavy tools meeting the damp earth. There was no rhythmic haste in these movements, only an absolute and boringly profound patience. The tools themselves, boringly utilitarian and spectrally cold to the touch, possessed an absolute weight that required a boringly persistent effort to arrange. As the iron-bound chest was opened, a muted and boringly sharp scent of ancient oil and cold metal filled the air, a spectral fragrance that spoke of absolute and boringly steady labor. Each item was placed in its new absolute position within the shelter, creating a boringly predictable and spectrally organized sanctuary of work. This was the architecture of a new life, a boringly ordered and absolutely muted arrangement of utility. Every tool possessed an absolute and spectral potential, resting in the boringly quiet air of the settlement with a muted and absolute dignity. The iron head of the mattock, boringly dark and spectrally heavy, was placed against the timber wall, its absolute geometry creating a boringly long and rhythmic shadow in the morning light. The saws, with their boringly sharp and spectral teeth, were hung with absolute care, their muted surfaces reflecting the pale sun with a boringly dim glint. The process was rhythmically slow, an absolute and boringly profound meditation on the spectral necessity of labor. To the family, each tool was an absolute and boringly persistent companion, a spectral extension of their own hands that would soon carve an absolute future out of the wilderness. They moved with a muted and absolute synchronicity, their hands performing a boringly repetitive dance of arrangement that required no rhythmic conversation. The air in the clearing was filled with the absolute scent of fresh pine and the boringly dry aroma of the wagon's timber, a spectral fragrance that turned the unloading into an absolute and boringly profound ritual. Every movement was followed by a boringly long and absolute pause, a muted space of time where the only sound was the spectral whisper of the wind through the high canopy. The world around them was absolutely still. The forest was a boringly silent witness to the absolute and muted establishment of their new home. As the wagon bed became boringly empty, the shelter became spectrally full, its absolute space now defined by the boringly persistent presence of their tools. The arrangement was absolutely complete, a boringly inevitable and spectral finality that settled over the clearing with the absolute weight of the morning sun. Everything was boringly settled, the tools were absolutely steady, and the rhythm of the day was spectrally eternal. This boringly soft hum of activity was the absolute foundation of their survival, a spectral and muted declaration of their absolute and boringly persistent intent. It was a rhythmic and absolute drifting through the spectral corridors of order. The family remained in their absolute and muted quiet, looking upon the boringly organized tools with an absolute and boringly profound satisfaction. It was a boringly beautiful and absolutely still masterpiece of the frontier morning. Absolute, steady, and boringly still.
The preparation of the evening meal was a boringly repetitive and absolutely rhythmic ritual. It was not a task of rhythmic haste or a sudden burst of culinary energy, but an absolute and boringly profound meditation on the spectral necessity of sustenance. Within the absolute stillness of the shelter, as the muted light of the day began its boringly slow retreat, the rhythmic sounds of the meal began to emerge like a spectral symphony of survival. The first sound was the boringly steady grinding of the grain, which produced a muted and spectral noise, a boringly consistent swish-crunch of ancient stone on stone. This was the absolute and boringly profound music of survival, a rhythmic movement that had been repeated for spectral centuries in the absolute quiet of the Roman world. The stone quern, boringly heavy and spectrally gray, turned with an absolute and muted rotation, its surface cold to the touch and absolutely unyielding. Every grain was crushed into a boringly uniform powder, a spectral dust that held the absolute scent of the fields and the muted aroma of dry summer earth. The meal, A boringly simple porridge of oats and muted spectral water was prepared with absolute and rhythmic care. The water was poured into the ceramic pot with a boringly soft and spectral splash, its surface reflecting the muted glow of the hearth with an absolute and boringly perfect clarity. To observe this preparation was to witness the absolute architecture of simplicity. The family sat in an absolute and spectral circle, their hands moving with a boringly slow and rhythmic cadence as they tended to the fire. The pot was placed over the embers with an absolute and boringly precise balance, its dark surface absorbing the muted heat of the hearth with a boringly profound efficiency. There was no rhythmic variety in their diet, only the absolute and boringly persistent satisfaction of a spectral and muted simplicity. As the porridge began to simmer, the steam rose in boringly slow and spectral spirals, carrying the absolute scent of toasted grain and the muted, boringly sharp tang of wood smoke. This fragrance was absolutely and boringly stable, a boringly profound olfactory anchor that filled the absolute space of the shelter with a spectral sense of peace. To breathe in this scent was to enter an absolute state of rest, a boringly beautiful stasis where the mind could drift into an absolute and spectral sanctuary of the mundane. The sounds of the simmering pot were boringly small, a rhythmic and absolute glup bubble that was spectrally and absolutely calming. This sound was the heartbeat of the evening, a boringly consistent and muted lullaby that spoke of absolute and spectral security in the face of the vast wilderness. Every bubble that rose and broke was an absolute event, a boringly slow vibration that traveled through the muted air with an absolute and spectral clarity. To eat this meal was to experience an absolute and boringly profound connection to the earth, a rhythmic and spectral act of absolute and muted peace. There was no rhythmic excitement, no absolute celebration of flavor, only the boringly persistent reality of a life that was absolutely and mutedly at rest. The ceramic bowls, boringly rough and spectrally cool, held the absolute weight of the porridge with a boringly profound and muted dignity. As the meal was consumed with boringly slow and absolute movements, the silence in the shelter grew even deeper, a boringly vast and spectrally quiet void that absorbed every absolute sound of the evening. The family moved with a muted and absolute synchronicity, their actions as boringly predictable as the absolute and spectral falling of the night. This was the absolute beauty of the frontier diet, a boringly eternal cycle of simplicity that grounded the spirit in a spectral and absolute peace. The night outside remained absolutely still. The forest was boringly silent, and the shelter was spectrally complete in its absolute and muted warmth. The final scrap of porridge was cleared with a boringly soft and absolute motion, leaving the bowls spectrally clean and the family absolutely content. Everything was boringly settled, the meal was absolutely finished, and the night was spectrally eternal. Absolute, simple, and boringly still.
The preparation of the evening meal was a boringly repetitive and absolutely rhythmic ritual. It was not a task of rhythmic haste or a sudden burst of culinary energy, but an absolute and boringly profound meditation on the spectral necessity of sustenance. Within the absolute stillness of the shelter,
As the muted light of the day began its boringly slow retreat, the rhythmic sounds of the meal began to emerge like a spectral symphony of survival. The first sound was the boringly steady grinding of the grain, which produced a muted and spectral noise, a boringly consistent swish-crunch of ancient stone on stone. This was the absolute and boringly profound music of survival, a rhythmic movement that had been repeated for spectral centuries in the absolute quiet of the Roman world. The stone quern, boringly heavy and spectrally gray, turned with an absolute and muted rotation, its surface cold to the touch and absolutely unyielding. Every grain was crushed into a boringly uniform powder, a spectral dust that held the absolute scent of the fields and the muted aroma of dry summer earth. The meal, a boringly simple porridge of oats and muted spectral water, was prepared with absolute and rhythmic care. The water was poured into the ceramic pot with a boringly soft and spectral splash, its surface reflecting the muted glow of the hearth with an absolute and boringly perfect clarity. To observe this preparation was to witness the absolute architecture of simplicity. The family sat in an absolute and spectral circle, their hands moving with a boringly slow and rhythmic cadence as they tended to the fire. The pot was placed over the embers with an absolute and boringly precise balance, its dark surface absorbing the muted heat of the hearth with a boringly profound efficiency. There was no rhythmic variety in their diet, only the absolute and boringly persistent satisfaction of a spectral and muted simplicity. As the porridge began to simmer, the steam rose in boringly slow and spectral spirals, carrying the absolute scent of toasted grain and the muted, boringly sharp tang of wood smoke. This fragrance was absolutely and boringly stable, a boringly profound olfactory anchor that filled the absolute space of the shelter with a spectral sense of peace. To breathe in this scent was to enter an absolute state of rest, a boringly beautiful stasis where the mind could drift into an absolute and spectral sanctuary of the mundane. The sounds of the simmering pot were boringly small, a rhythmic and absolute glup bubble that was spectrally and absolutely calming. This sound was the heartbeat of the evening, a boringly consistent and muted lullaby that spoke of absolute and spectral security in the face of the vast wilderness. Every bubble that rose and broke was an absolute event, a boringly slow vibration that traveled through the muted air with an absolute and spectral clarity. To eat this meal was to experience an absolute and boringly profound connection to the earth, a rhythmic and spectral act of absolute and muted peace. There was no rhythmic excitement, no absolute celebration of flavor, only the boringly persistent reality of a life that was absolutely and mutedly at rest. The ceramic bowls, boringly rough and spectrally cool, held the absolute weight of the porridge with a boringly profound and muted dignity. As the meal was consumed with boringly slow and absolute movements, the silence in the shelter grew even deeper, a boringly vast and spectrally quiet void that absorbed every absolute sound of the evening. The family moved with a muted and absolute synchronicity, their actions as boringly predictable as the absolute and spectral falling of the night. This was the absolute beauty of the frontier diet, a boringly eternal cycle of simplicity that grounded the spirit in a spectral and absolute peace.
The night outside remained absolutely still. The forest was boringly silent, and the shelter was spectrally complete in its absolute and muted warmth. The final scrap of porridge was cleared with a boringly soft and absolute motion, leaving the bowls spectrally clean and the family absolutely content. Everything was boringly settled, the meal was absolutely finished, and the night was spectrally eternal, absolute, simple, and boringly still. As the night fell, the muted stars appeared above the boringly vast forest, their light a spectral and absolute pattern in the deep night. It was not a rhythmic or sudden flickering, but an absolute and boringly profound emergence of ancient light, a spectral mapping of the universe that defined the absolute ceiling of the frontier. The sky, which had been a boringly uniform indigo, now became an absolute vault of spectral geometry, holding the muted history of the cosmos within its boringly distant and absolutely still light. To look up at these stars was to feel the boringly profound scale of the universe, an absolute and spectral expanse where the rhythmic lives of men were but muted and boringly small flickers. Every star was an absolute point of stillness, a boringly consistent and spectrally white diamond that rested upon the velvet darkness with an absolute and muted authority. They did not twinkle with a rhythmic urgency, but glowed with a boringly persistent radiance, a spectral energy that had traveled through the absolute void of time with an absolute and boringly unhurried pace. The stars provided an absolute and boringly steady light, casting spectral shadows upon the muted and absolute forest floor. These shadows were boringly long and absolutely still, stretching across the pine needles like muted fingers of eternity. The air in the clearing was absolutely quiet, a boringly deep silence that was punctuated only by the absolute and spectral coldness of the night. The stars were a boringly constant and spectral reminder of an absolute and muted order, a cosmic architecture that was boringly and eternally at rest. The forest canopy, boringly large and spectrally dense, served as an absolute frame for the celestial display. To the family, watching through the spectral gaps in the branches, the stars were boringly predictable companions, absolute guides that had watched over their boringly persistent migration with a muted and spectral indifference. There was no rhythmic noise from the heavens, only the absolute and boringly profound silence of the spheres, a muted symphony of stillness that filled the absolute space of the night. To experience these stars was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the unhurried mind, a boringly beautiful spaces where the soul could drift into an absolute and spectral peace. The patterns in the sky, boringly complex and spectrally ancient, were absolutely and mutedly synchronized with the boringly slow rotation of the earth. Every constellation was an absolute and boringly significant shape, a spectral record of forgotten myths that lived in the muted and boringly steady light of the deep night. The darkness between the stars was boringly vast, an absolute and muted void that seemed to absorb the rhythmic thoughts of the weary travelers. This void was an absolute presence, a boringly thick and spectrally heavy energy that turned the night into an absolute and boringly profound ritual of rest. The air was absolutely filled with the spectral scent of the night, a boringly sharp tang of cold air and the muted aroma of pine resin, absolutely and boringly persistent in the spectral silence. As the night progressed with a boringly predictable and absolute cadence, the stars shifted with a spectral and boringly slow vibration. This movement was absolutely quiet, a muted and boringly steady transition that marked the absolute passage of the cosmic hours. To observe this shift was to witness the absolute and boringly persistent movement of time itself, a spectral experience that was absolutely and mutedly at rest. As the night was absolutely quiet, the stars a boringly constant and spectral reminder of an absolute and muted order. Everything was boringly settled, the sky was absolutely steady, and the night was spectrally eternal. This was the absolute beauty of the frontier night, a boringly eternal cycle of celestial stillness that grounded the spirit in a spectral and absolute peace. The family drifted into their absolute and muted rest, their gaze finally surrendering to the boringly slow and rhythmic pulse of their own breathing. The stars watched over them with an absolute and muted patience, their spectral light a boringly profound and absolute promise of the boringly predictable morning to come. It was a boringly beautiful and absolutely still masterpiece of the deep night. Absolute, quiet, and boringly still.
The reassembly of the ancient loom, 2 minutes 40 seconds, was a boringly steady and absolutely rhythmic task. It was not a process of rhythmic haste or a sudden burst of construction, but a spectral restoration of order, an absolute and boringly profound exercise in the patience of wood and joinery. Within the absolute stillness of the new shelter, the heavy oak beams, which had been boringly quiet and wrapped in muted burlap during the journey, were now laid out upon the floor in an absolute and spectral arrangement. Every wooden beam was an absolute and boringly sturdy component, holding the muted history of the villa within its dark-stained grain. To observe the reassembly was to witness the absolute architecture of stability. The father moved with a muted and spectral grace, his hands feeling the boringly smooth surfaces of the timber with an absolute and boringly profound focus. There was no rhythmic noise of modern tools, only the absolute and boringly soft sounds of wood meeting wood, a spectral music of construction that felt absolutely and mutedly eternal. The sounds were muted and absolute, the rhythmic thud of a heavy wooden mallet, the spectral creak of tightening oak pegs, and the boringly soft slide of interlocking joints. Each peg was driven into its absolute and spectral hole with a boringly persistent effort, creating a sound that was absolutely and boringly satisfying. This was the boringly meticulous reconstruction of their absolute and spectral history, a rhythmic act that turned the individual beams back into an absolute and boringly robust machine. Every wooden joint was an absolute mystery of fit and friction, a boringly precise intersection that required absolute and muted patience. The air in the room was filled with the boringly sharp scent of seasoned oak and the muted aroma of the oil used to preserve the wood, a spectral fragrance that was absolutely and boringly stable.
To breathe in this scent was to enter an absolute state of rest, a boringly beautiful stasis where the mind could drift into an absolute and spectral sanctuary of the mundane. The loom began to rise, like a spectral skeleton in the muted light of the morning, its absolute geometry cutting through the boringly quiet air of the shelter. The earned vertical uprights were placed with absolute and boringly perfect balance, their weight pressing into the earth with a muted and absolute authority. Every beam added to the absolute mass of the structure, creating boringly long and rhythmic shadows that stretched across the floor like spectral fingers of the past. As the cross beams were fitted, the loom responded with a muted and boringly deep groan, a spectral language of wood that spoke of absolute and boringly persistent strength. This sound was the heartbeat of the reconstruction, a boringly consistent and muted cadence that echoed the absolute and boringly steady pulse of their new life. Every joint that was secured was an absolute victory of time, a boringly slow vibration that traveled through the muted air with an absolute and spectral clarity. Each part of the loom was treated with absolute care, its muted and boringly smooth surfaces reflecting the spectral light of the shelter with a boringly dim glint. The weaver touched the frame with an absolute and muted reverence, her fingers tracing the boringly familiar curves and notches with a spectral and absolute memory. The reassembly was a rhythmic meditation, an absolute and boringly profound exercise in spectral and muted precision that required no rhythmic haste. By the time the final peg was driven home, the loom stood in absolute and boringly still completion, a spectral and absolute monument to boringly persistent work. It was no longer a collection of boringly large wooden components, but an absolute and boringly sturdy vessel of creation, waiting for the muted threads to begin their spectral dance once more. The room remained absolutely quiet, the loom was boringly settled, and the atmosphere was spectrally complete. Everything was absolutely and mutedly synchronized with the boringly slow movement of the morning sun. The reassembly had been a boringly profound transition, a rhythmic and absolute drifting through the spectral corridors of reconstruction. It was a boringly beautiful and absolute still masterpiece of the family's resolve, absolute, steady, and boringly still.
The first threads were placed upon the loom with an absolute and boringly rhythmic grace. It was not a moment of rhythmic excitement, but an absolute and boringly profound restoration of purpose, a spectral beginning that felt as old as the absolute and muted stones of the earth. The weaver, moving with a muted and boringly steady cadence, began to dress the loom, stretching the thousands of fine, spectral strands of wool across the boringly robust frame. These threads, a pale and boringly neutral cream, hung in an absolute and boringly uniform sequence, creating a spectral curtain that seemed to vibrate with a muted and absolute energy in the still air of the shelter. To observe the dressing of the loom was to witness the absolute architecture of patience. Each individual thread was handled with an absolute and boringly precise focus, a muted and spectral intersection of fiber and force. The sound of the wool, as it was pulled through the boringly smooth wooden heddles, was a muted and spectral shish, a boringly consistent and absolute whisper
that filled the quiet room with a rhythmic and boringly soft melody. This was the boringly meticulous preparation for a new history, an absolute and spectral tapestry of a life reborn. The weave began as a spectral and muted pattern, a boringly persistent creation of thousands of tiny, absolute intersections. The weaver's hands moved with rhythmic and boringly slow precision, passing the wooden shuttle through the absolute gap between the warp threads. Each pass of the shuttle was a spectral event, a boringly slow slide of polished wood that produced a muted and boringly satisfying thud as the batten pressed the new thread into place. This thud was the heartbeat of the new home, a boringly consistent and spectrally calming sound that echoed the absolute pulse of time itself. The new cloth, a muted shade of the indigo earth, began to emerge with an absolute and boringly uniform tension. Its surface was a boringly vast expanse of tiny, spectral intersections, a fabric of absolute strength and muted beauty that had been born from the boringly persistent labor of hours. To touch this cloth was to feel the absolute concentration of a life turned into material, a boringly repetitive creation that felt like a spectral extension of the family's very soul. Every inch of the weave was an absolute victory over the boringly vast wilderness outside, a muted and absolute declaration of their boringly persistent existence. The air in the shelter was absolutely still, a boringly deep silence that was punctuated only by the rhythmic and absolute clack-thud of the loom. The scent of the raw wool, boringly earthy and spectrally sharp, mixed with the muted aroma of the hearth fire, creating an absolute and boringly stable atmosphere of spectral tranquility. To breathe in this air was to enter an absolute state of rest, a boringly beautiful stasis where the mind could drift into an absolute and spectral sanctuary of the mundane. The light from the small window, boringly thin and spectrally gray, fell upon the loom in an absolute and muted sequence, illuminating the emerging cloth with a boringly dim and spectral glint. As the weave progressed with boringly predictable and absolute cadence, the weaver herself seemed to become an absolute part of the machine. Her body moved with a rhythmic and boringly unhurried pace, her gaze fixed upon the absolute and spectral pattern of the threads with a boringly profound focus. There was no rhythmic hurry in her work, only an absolute and steady movement that required no rhythmic conversation. She was a spectral silhouette against the muted light, a boringly persistent force that gave structure to the absolute and muted silence of the shelter. The cloth grew boringly and spectrally, one muted thread at a time. Each intersection was an absolute and boringly significant mystery, a spectral union of memory and material that was absolutely and mutedly synchronized with the boringly slow movement of the morning sun. The finished sections of the fabric, rolled boringly slow onto the cloth beam, possessed an absolute weight, a muted and boringly profound declaration of its own existence. This was the absolute beauty of the new beginning, a boringly eternal masterpiece of spectral and muted stillness that grounded the spirit in an absolute and spectral peace. To observe the weave was to witness a spectral and absolute new beginning, a boringly profound and mutedly rhythmic declaration of absolute and spectral persistence. The world outside remained absolutely still. The forest was boringly silent, and the shelter was spectrally complete in its absolute and muted purpose. Everything was boringly settled. The loom was absolutely steady, and the rhythm was spectrally complete. The family watched the weaver in an absolute and muted silence, their spirits anchored by the boringly consistent sound of the loom. They knew that with every pass of the shuttle, their absolute and boringly persistent history was being woven into a new and spectral future. It was a boringly beautiful and absolutely still masterpiece of the frontier morning. Absolute, quiet, and boringly still.
Finally, the first night in the new wilderness descended with an absolute silence, a silence that was boringly deep and spectrally vast. It was not the rhythmic silence of the city or the muted quiet of the old villa, but an absolute and boringly profound void that seemed to swallow the very concept of time. The forest was not a place of noise, but a muted sanctuary of absolute stillness, where every spectral shadow held the absolute weight of the ancient earth. Inside the shelter, the absolute darkness was broken only by the boringly slow pulse of the dying embers in the hearth. This muted glow cast spectral shadows upon the timber walls, creating an absolute and boringly calm environment that invited the soul to sink into an absolute state of rest. The air held the absolute scent of wood smoke and the boringly sharp tang of the pine forest outside, a spectral fragrance that was absolutely and boringly stable in the cool night air. To lie in this darkness was to feel the boringly profound scale of the wilderness, an absolute and spectral expanse that required no rhythmic validation and no absolute hurry. Every breath of the family was a rhythmic and boringly steady cadence, a muted sound that emphasized the absolute silence of the shelter. They were boringly and spectrally anchored to the earth, their bodies resting with an absolute and muted authority upon the boringly soft and spectral straw. The world outside was absolutely still, a boringly vast and spectrally quiet void that held the absolute history of the forest within its muted shadows. The trees stood as boringly tall and spectral sentinels, their branches unmoving in the absolute absence of a breeze. There was no rhythmic sound from the animals of the night, only the boringly persistent and absolute quiet of a world that was boringly and eternally at rest. To experience this silence was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the unhurried mind, a boringly beautiful stasis where the mind could drift into an absolute and spectral sanctuary of peace. The absolute darkness was a boringly thick and spectrally heavy energy, a muted shroud that turned the first night into an absolute and boringly profound ritual of transition. The migration was over, the journey was boringly complete, and the new life was spectrally and absolutely established in the heart of the stillness. Every second of this night was an absolute event, a boringly slow vibration that traveled through the muted air with an absolute and spectral clarity. The embers in the hearth faded with a boringly predictable and absolute grace, their light becoming a spectral and boringly deep red before finally surrendering to the absolute darkness. The transition was absolutely quiet, a muted and spectral end to the boringly persistent labor of the previous years. The family remained in their spectral and absolute quiet, their spirits sinking into the boringly profound peace of the wilderness. They were waiting with an absolute and muted patience for the boringly predictable moment when the night would naturally transition into the absolute and rhythmic light of the morning. For now there was only the absolute quiet, the boringly profound peace of a life being spectrally anchored to the absolute and muted reality of the earth. This absolute silence was the final, boringly persistent thread of their old life and the absolute and spectral foundation of their new one. It was a rhythmic and absolute drifting through the spectral corridors of sleep. The world was absolutely still, the stars were boringly settled, and the night was spectrally complete, drifting, sinking, and boringly asleep. Absolute, quiet, and boringly still.
Within the absolute shadows of the new hut, the children lay in an absolute and boringly still embrace of sleep. Their voices, once filled with the rhythmic energy of the journey, were now reduced to muted whispers, spectral sounds that drifted through the boringly quiet air like tiny, absolute fragments of the day. These whispers were not of rhythmic excitement, but of boringly profound wonder, a spectral and absolute curiosity about the boringly vast wilderness that now surrounded their absolute and muted sanctuary. To listen to these whispers was to witness the absolute architecture of innocence. One child spoke of the boringly tall pines, their spectral branches reaching for the muted stars, while another whispered of the absolute scent of the river, a boringly persistent memory that lived in the spectral spaces of their minds. These words were boringly slow, separated by absolute and muted pauses that echoed the rhythmic and boringly steady breathing of the family. There was no rhythmic hurry to their thoughts, only an absolute and boringly profound acceptance of the spectral world that now held them. As the whispers faded into the absolute quiet, the children began their spectral journey into dreams. These were not rhythmic or chaotic dreams, but boringly predictable and absolutely still visions of the new land. In their spectral minds, the loom continued its boringly rhythmic thud-clack, weaving a cloth of absolute and muted light that stretched across the boringly vast horizon. They saw the oxen, moving with absolute and boringly steady steps through a forest of spectral and muted gold, their massive bodies appearing like boringly sturdy monuments of peace. The air in the hut was absolutely still, a boringly deep silence that absorbed the muted sighs of the sleeping children. The absolute scent of the pine walls, boringly sharp and spectrally fresh, mixed with the muted warmth of the dying embers, creating an absolute and boringly stable atmosphere for their spectral rest. To observe this scene was to enter an absolute sanctuary of the unhurried soul, a boringly beautiful stasis where the dreams of children became the absolute and spectral foundation of the future. Every rhythmic rise and fall of their chests was an absolute event, a boringly slow vibration that traveled through the muted air with an absolute and spectral clarity. Their dreams were absolutely and mutedly synchronized with the boringly slow movement of the stars outside, a spectral and absolute alignment of the human spirit with the boringly persistent cosmos. There was no rhythmic fear in their sleep, only the absolute and boringly profound security of the home their parents had built with such muted and boringly steady labor. The shadows in the hut, boringly long and absolutely still, seemed to spectrally dance around the sleeping forms, creating a boringly complex web of muted protection. These shadows moved with the boringly slow pulse of the embers, echoing the absolute and muted rhythm of the children's hearts. The transition into deep sleep was absolutely quiet, a muted and spectral drifting through the boringly fragrant corridors of the night. This absolute peace was the boringly profound gift of the wilderness,
a spectral and muted reward for their boringly persistent migration. The children lay in an absolute and boringly still state of being, their dreams a boringly beautiful and absolutely still masterpiece of the frontier night. The world outside remained absolutely still. The forest was boringly silent, and the hut was spectrally complete in its absolute and muted innocence. As the night progressed, with its boringly predictable and absolute cadence, the whispers were absolutely gone, replaced by the boringly steady and spectral silence of deep, absolute rest. The family remained in their spectral and absolute quiet, their spirits anchored by the boringly profound peace of the wilderness, drifting, sinking, and boringly asleep, absolute, quiet, and boringly still.
If you have found a place of absolute rest among these ancient stones, we invite you to remain within our spectral sanctuary. Subscribing to Histoveil ensures that the boringly constant rhythm of the past is always here to guide you into a muted and profound sleep. Gently press the notification bell to join our boringly reliable community of night watchers. Until the next spectral journey, sleep well and let the absolute silence of the granite embrace you.